Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Nadyne McKie, and Nadine's got all sorts of experience in working with a whole load of different people, and she's going to explain more about this herself. She also has experience of long COVID, not only herself, but also with her child. So we're going to be talking all sorts of things today. A very warm welcome to the podcast today, Nadyne. I'm so glad we finally got to do this.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me on. Very excited to talk to you.
Before we kind of dive too deep down whichever rabbit hole we're going down first, would you just say a little bit about yourself and kind of what it is that you do?
So I call myself a mind-body therapist because I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a yoga therapist. I also work with the breath. I'm a breathing coach too. And what I love about what I do is that I can help to support people, not just through talking therapy, but also through addressing, our health and general well-being with the body as well. So it's a lovely blend, I find. And I think also it's a blend of therapy and support for people that we really need, because we are human beings, a full body. We're not just a brain, and we're not just our mental health, and we're not just our physical health. And so much of how we perhaps have been taught to look at ourselves kind of separates everything. And actually, when we don't separate everything, when we bring it all together, it starts to make more sense, I think. And that is also a perfect blend for working within yoga therapy as well, because yoga, of course, is about that very thing, that we are not just a mind, not just a body, we are everything. And that needs to be how we look at our health and general well-being, for sure. So yeah, that's kind of why I do what I do, I guess. But also I am a therapist. I work in psychiatric hospital, in acute mental health services, and I run a private practice where I predominantly work and have been doing so for the last where are we now? 24, aren't we? So it must have been 4 years at least, with management of chronic health conditions. And that is, for me, has been specifically fatigue-based conditions. And obviously long COVID, which I have personal experience of myself. And as you said, my son also experienced long COVID, post-COVID 2 years ago, and is recovered. But, I think as everybody who might have experienced this or gone through a fatigue-based condition kind of realizes, and sometimes it's not a very pleasant realization, it's not that we necessarily ever go back to how we were. And I think that's a really important part of, certainly was of my learning journey, but also of the journey that I go on with my clients and people that I work with, is understanding that, we might need to address some stuff and how we've been living and how we might perceive recovery and what that might mean, and kind of looking towards a new normal for ourselves, which, you and I have spoken about this. It's a horrible experience going through a fatigue condition, and long COVID especially, because it encompasses so many different symptoms. And despite it being a horrible experience, for the most part, I think for myself and people that I've worked with, there is a kind of beauty in the journey not in the experience, obviously. So this is not to dismiss how absolutely bloody awful it is to feel that way. And it's horrendous. And to deal with the stuff that goes alongside dealing with what is essentially an invisible kind of disability. But actually allowing ourselves to have the opportunity to learn, to use that space to learn about ourselves and maybe gain some self-awareness and look at life a little bit differently. And a lot of people do come away, I think, into that recovery period and feeling a lot better, understanding themselves a bit more, which I think is a beautiful thing. Because we're all kind of on that journey, really, aren't we?
Yeah.
Getting to know us, what helps us, what doesn't help us, what do we enjoy, what brings us joy.
It's always quite difficult to talk about. And I've noticed that, I'm now a year and a bit, on from recovery. And, a lot of things have changed in the last year and a bit. I'm able to look back on it with a slightly different perspective than a year ago when I just recovered, or certainly a couple of years ago when I was still sort of in the middle of it. So certainly for me that has changed. But I think that distance does give you this kind of ability to go, oh my goodness, that was horrendous. But also now I've got a bit of space from it. I can look back and think, okay, I am now living a very much better life than I was before. I'm so much happier. I wouldn't have considered myself unhappy before, but now looking back on it, that there's quite a difference. And I love this idea of, you know, personal development, or this kind of more greater awareness that you were saying of, I guess, everything. Actually, I find myself so much more aware of everything, in my body, out of my body, in my head, just around me. I notice things, birds and skies and things that I didn't before. But yeah, this kind of experience. And I suppose for me, it was making something from an experience that I didn't ask for, I didn't want, and I didn't enjoy. But I was put in that position and I sort of had to find my way through. And yeah, I guess, make the best of it, yeah, terrible situation. So what can I do now? I think it's always been, what can I do? Has always been my kind of question, really.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I wonder what would it be like to change that and say, well, how can I be in there in a way that better supports myself through this experience? And maybe, we look for things to do. And, I know I remember that feeling myself when I had COVID and feeling really quite fearful for many reasons. One, it was the first time I've really experienced being breathless. That was obviously very scary and is understandably scary because this is how our body works. When we can't breathe, that alarm system is sounding loud and clear. So, of course. And yet also there was a feeling like I wanted to get rid of this thing, as quick as possible. And I think that's probably how I'd approach lots of different areas of my life. Like, how can I get through this as quickly as possible? How can I get to the next thing because I'm so busy, or I need to do this? And, you and I were kind of laughing earlier about, self-confessed plate spinning. And I think that's a big aspect to the learning process, is recognizing how that affects us as well when we're trying to recover specifically. And it's something I think I'm becoming more aware of for myself. And look, I am a work in progress for sure, as we all are in our own specific way. But I think it's one of the things that, like you said, you don't necessarily, until you've got the benefit of kind of time away from the illness itself, you can kind of look back and think, oh my goodness, I was doing so much. I was doing so much. And I think one of the things that comes across to me when I'm working with people is not necessarily recognizing when we're stressed, like that ability to disconnect from how we're really feeling, because it becomes so commonplace and becomes our kind of normal to live in that state on an almost constant basis. And of course that contributes too. And I'm absolutely not saying that that's the cause of getting long COVID, not at all. But I've yet to meet somebody, I think, who has gone on to sadly experience long COVID that wasn't extremely stressed prior to, getting COVID, which of course is nobody's fault. This virus came along and there it was. But I think the experience of being stressed and not necessarily recognizing stress and how to manage it is also a very interesting part of a recovery journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, certainly for me, it sounds like you were maybe in a similar position and a lot of other people as well, where you're so used to being busy. And, maybe there were patterns from before, from childhood, or maybe there weren't, but, where the act of resting, of not doing, is seen as lazy. I mean, certainly that was my experience. If you're doing nothing, then that there's something you should be doing. So it kind of feeds into that. So, you're bouncing around, always busy. And, that kind of fight, flight place, it's all you ever know. It's your home away from home. And then it can be very difficult to feel comfortable in other places. And I still find that now. I sit and read books at lunchtime sometimes. And occasionally I'll catch myself going, this is a bit lazy. Shouldn't you be working? Actually, no. No, I can read books at lunchtime. That's not lazy. That's me taking time for myself. And I can still kind of feel some of those things. So I think, like you said, it's very difficult to sometimes recognize stress if it's all you've ever known. And there's also, as we now understand, having been through this experience of long COVID, that there's a lot of different types of stress as well. So it might be physical, it might be cognitive, it might be emotional, it might be social, it might be, whatever other types of stress there are. And they're not always that easy to recognize, are they?
No, they're really not. And I think you've made some really valid points there that, the need to be and feel productive all the time, need to keep achieving, to strive on and push through and keep going. These are kind of phrases that are almost celebrated in so many ways. And that's the exact opposite, really, of what creates a healthy environment for healing and recovery of anything, let alone long COVID and fatigue. But you've touched upon a few things which I think is really interesting to me. Is stress is one thing, and we know that stress and feeling stressed kind of chronically disrupts our systems and certainly dysregulates our nervous system. And like you said, we become accustomed to that oh so familiar place of feeling stress because, and we might only recognize that, and I absolutely hold my hands up, is when we come to rest or feel like we need to relax, that phrase, oh, you just need to relax. But what if it's really difficult to relax? What if relaxing is actually the most challenging
Mm.
thing? And I remember when I first started yoga, I was the person who used to leave when it got to the laying down bit at the end, the shavasana. I'd be like, oh, almost itching out of my skin, like this can't, oh no, this is just too foreign, I can't do this. This is awful. I can't stand it. And now I definitely can rest. I mean, I would say I still probably would like to rest more. And yeah, as I said, I work on that myself and I hold my hands up because I'm just a human, and I make mistakes and I don't always recognize my signals all the time. But I certainly feel like societally, especially when there's an illness concern, there is a real need to kind of get back into our lives as quickly as possible. And of course, I want to recognize that taking time out is a privilege for many people because it is not always doable. And there are lots of restrictions on our time, such as work and family, and so many people that care for other people. And that caring is 24/7. And so there are lots of impacts to our daily life that we might not recognize because they become just the norm that are actually very, very stressful. And I think that you mentioned, these different kind of stressors like the cognitive and physical and these things that drain our energy And I think we're learning more and more how impactful those things are. Like, people talk about their social battery running low, and maybe we haven't really recognized that actually being social and having social connections is obviously very, very important. And of course, at a time when many of us were going through COVID and then experiencing long COVID, we had a lack of social connections and felt very isolated for different reasons, but specifically due to the isolation of lockdown and being unwell. And I think that turned us towards maybe trying to find that connection online. And then we come into the more like cognitive fatigue states that happen when we spend a lot of time online. And I address this a lot with clients in terms of recognizing those body signals, recognizing our breathing patterns and when they change, and being online. Wow, does that change how we breathe? Because our bodies kind of go into this automatic state where they're almost primed to get a notification or scrolling through, and we kind of go into this almost apnea, low, shallow breathing state where we're just not getting an effective, breath circulating in our body. So of course, we're going to come away feeling more fatigued. And I think it's through that journey of starting to recognize these things within us, and also in the world around us, this kind of push on through culture in which we live, which doesn't really, I don't know, not acknowledge, but it certainly doesn't encourage rest and recovery in the way that actually I think long COVID really requires. And that's a super important part of the healing journey. And that's certainly, why Fiona and I, who I wrote the book with, we wanted to really make that acknowledgement that this is not something that is always internally driven. There are lots of internal contributing factors. And yeah, we might have been set up with patterns from childhood where not doing anything is seen as really lazy, or taking care of ourselves and our own needs is selfish. And they might have followed us into adulthood for various reasons. And we might find ourselves on that kind of hamster wheel, the kind of constant treadmill of not wanting to down tools or not being able to down tools and rest and recover. And so we kind of approached it from a place of looking at how we can come back towards that art of convalescence. Like, what does it really mean to recover? What do our bodies really need? And for me, I say this, I can say this now, I guess, with a bit more humor, but at the time, honestly, resting felt like torture. And now I feel like, oh, I felt maybe like I'm a bit of a rebel for resting now, because I'm like, yeah, I'm resting. Whilst the outside world is doing the everything, now I can actually rest because I know I need it away from everything.
It's a really interesting word. I think, when I was unwell, it was something that I did because I had to, but I hated it. It was a waste of time. I was, resting my life away was kind of how I saw it. I found it very difficult. I found it, like you, very uncomfortable. It's not easy to do for someone who's never really done it before. And it is very interesting now, I will also hold my hand up and say that, I can get caught up in things. And, there's definitely times where in the morning I've gone, I'm going to make sure I take time over lunch to actually just stop and sit in the garden and, literally smell the flowers kind of thing. And I don't always do it. In fact, I often don't, but I appreciate it now in a way that I didn't. So that's definitely been a sort of change, I think. Going back to something you said earlier, now I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember exactly what you said. But it was something along the lines of being in the moment rather than what can I do, what can I be, I think was what you said. And I've always been a very proactive person. If there's a problem, I'm going to fix it because I'm a fixer. And this was both a useful and a unhelpful quality, I think. Going out and searching out things that were going to help me, proactively was what found me my way through recovery. It was those things that I found. But I think also taking that time to sit in the moment, to be in that, uncomfortable often space. And, dare I even say the slightly dirty word acceptance? Where's the balance between all of that? Between let's find some things that help, let's look for some solutions, and let's just be in this moment.
We'll be right back.
I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one, because what's really important and also very, very challenging is keeping the mindset, or at least attempting to keep a mindset that recovery is possible, because it is. And that for many people takes varying amounts of time, because I think when we look at, that comparison of, person X recovered in this time, so if I don't meet that target myself, that means I've failed somehow. And that kind of patterning can follow us in so many ways. And because I work with the breath so much, that is a space where I really see that kind of push to want to get it right. I've got, even in recovery, people want to get it right and they've got to do everything. And yes, of course, we all want to get better when we're not feeling well, of course. And that often leads us to search out, because these things, specifically fatigue-based conditions, are still so under-researched and under kind of underknown, if that's a word, dismissed. And there is almost that battle to be heard, and so much misinformation about what it means to be experiencing a fatigue-based condition. And, I never want to hear another person say, oh, you just probably need a good nap. It's just like, oh, you obviously don't really understand fatigue.
I'm tired too.
Oh, yeah, life is tiring, isn't it? Oh, God, yeah. But I remember I was working with a now retired pediatrician, and she was saying to me how she was also experiencing long COVID. And she was saying, I didn't used to believe people when they had this condition. I used to think, because there was that real kind of disbelief that, you're probably just, a bit tired, kind of buck up, get on with it. We're all tired. But when you actually experience it yourself, and I think this is kind of a pivotal moment, because we do have so many healthcare professionals now that have, sadly, really sadly, I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but they have experienced a post-viral fatigue, and it is debilitating, and your whole body feels like lead. And it's not just a nap that you need, this is your whole body kind of screaming like, no, we can't keep going in the way that we once did. And that's certainly how I experienced it, and often how I hear other people describe it to me too. And may have gone off on a little tangent here, but that experience of fatigue and going through recovery in that way, that maybe means that we start to kind of add the doing things. Oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. And sometimes I feel like with people I'm working with, there needs to be a recognition that our brain isn't necessarily recognizing that this huge to-do list of things we need to do to help ourselves is anything different from another to-do list of like life admin, and it still requires a lot of energy. And actually, even that can be very, very draining. And we can also set ourselves up to, if I don't do that, what does that mean for me? If I don't do that hour of mindfulness meditation, if I'm not resting for this long, or if I'm not able to do something that I need to do for myself, And we were talking earlier about, changing beds and the annoyance of it. But actually, both you and I agreed, it's really great to be able to change a bed now, because it's really tiring to do that. And I definitely couldn't do it when I was ill. It was way too much. So there is a real balance, as you were saying, between the acceptance of what is on a daily basis and also keeping in our minds, perhaps visualizing ourselves that, yes, we can recover. So that acceptance of what is super important, because that allows us to recognize the need to rest when we need to listen to those signals, which during that, our conversation about what it is to be so productive in life and be a doer and an achiever and plate spinner and constantly on the go, that often signals to me that we are in that place where we're not listening to our body signals. And there can be many, many reasons how we've come about, how that's come about, why we've learned and conditioned ourselves not to, and why that's been necessary perhaps at one point even in our lives. And yet it's going back to those basics of kind of checking in with ourselves that allows us to be able to have that acceptance of what is in the present moment. And yet, of course, yes, there is this balance of some days that feels really, really awful, to accept that we're feeling really dreadful that day and the symptoms are here, or we might be in a relapse phase. And then it's that other hard challenge of finding self-compassion in that moment as well, in that time, and being able to recognize what we need, and that's okay to have what we need and to find what we need, and to allow ourselves, almost to give ourselves permission for that. Because we might have been people, and this comes up so frequently, but people that have constantly been the looking after others people, the people that maybe find it hard to say no to stuff. We almost dismiss it into this little sentence of people pleasing, but it goes far beyond that. It's not just about being a people pleaser. It's about almost, patterning that comes in, like this need to make sure everybody else is okay. And again, that can come from a really deep place. And that might also need some acknowledgement of, where has this pattern come from that requires me to disconnect from myself, to look after others above and beyond me? Because that's another place that we might find ourselves needing to distract ourselves from, because sometimes it can be a painful place to go to, and a really challenging and uncomfortable place to acknowledge within us that that's how we've been living for whatever reason. And that's why I think that recovery really is a journey, as you say, of balance and of self-discovery, and yes, of challenge, and absolutely lots of discomfort within that for various reasons. But ultimately, I think if we can allow ourselves to have that acceptance and move towards, growing in self-awareness about what we need, and ideally towards that place of self-compassion, which, look, hey, it's never easy. Even if we're really, really good at giving it out in bucket loads to other people, it can be quite difficult to turn the mirror back on ourselves and reflect that kind of care and attention that we give to others back towards ourselves. It is a beautiful thing when we start to go onto that journey of getting there. And sometimes we need support for that. And that's really important as well, that we give ourselves that permission to seek support. And especially through management of long COVID and these fatigue-based conditions, which encompass so much, anxiety and dealing with medical appointments and medical dismissal. And luckily, there are some amazing people out there, amazing doctors, amazing healthcare professionals that really get what it means. And, that's why I think this is a real pivotal moment, because often those people are people that have experienced this themselves and are finding out that actually, yeah, this is something that requires a lot more attention in our healthcare system.
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
And I think there was something you were just saying about, the way that, again, it's not everybody, but a lot of people, the caregivers, who are always putting other people first, for whatever reason that is. And, they'll, you know, look after everybody else. They'll say really kind, be really empathetic, be really compassionate to everybody else except themselves. And it's almost like you treat yourself in the way that you would never, ever treat anybody else. And often we're not aware of it. Certainly, I fall into this trap even now sometimes. If I'm feeling tired one morning and I'm thinking, well, I was supposed to go for a run, so we're going to go for a run. And it's like, well, actually, maybe I've had a really hard week. Maybe I should do some yoga or go for a walk or stay in bed for an extra hour instead, which is all things that I would say to somebody else. But heaven forbid I should say it to myself, because for some reason I have different standards for myself where I have to beat myself up about everything, which is ridiculous, isn't it? But I guess it's like you were saying about that awareness. Once you're aware of some of these things, then you can start to catch them and go, is that really fair? Is that what you would say to somebody else?
Yeah, and it's often something that I find myself, kind of talking about with people, and it's certainly part of the book, is how do we begin to treat ourselves like we're our own best friend? Because as you said, to our best friends, we would never put them through the paces that we would put ourselves through, or talk to them in the way that we might talk to ourselves, internally, that internal voice that drives the doing, the constant doing, and being quite harsh towards ourselves. That self inner critic can be really quite mean. And yet we can be the most compassionate people and caring for others. And in fact, that can become the distraction from what we're really truly feeling. And, I talk about this a little bit in the book because it was definitely part of my own personal journey. And that acceptance and awareness that, I was saying about how I used to be the person that could, needed to leave yoga when it came to shavasana, I've got to get out of here, can't be. And for many of the reasons for that was because I was dealing with some really uncomfortable feelings and emotions that I didn't really want to sit with. And so the kind of non-doing activities, well, that was much easier to distract myself away from those feelings and not acknowledge them and just keep going. And it was only really during the experience of not being able to do and suddenly finding myself, all the things that I'd kind of used, I guess, for want of a better word, but used to help me support myself mentally, physically. And a lot of those things were exercise based and required a lot of doing and energy. And you know what? When you can't do those things anymore, when those things are kind of removed, then the sitting with what is essentially being with yourself can be very challenging. I certainly found that a very challenging time. And I think that that's something that is often kind of in the kind of subconsciously driving the constant doingness, and that need to, it's not even necessarily a need, but it's the knowledge that coming away from that low level constant stress, that space where we might live, the home from home, I think you called it, is so challenging, and so uncomfortable that we'd rather stay there. And it's definitely the recovery journey, I think, for many people, is the acknowledgement that, yeah, you know what, we might have been living there for quite a few years.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, I mean, beyond the physical discomfort of being with yourself when you're in pain or you're experiencing these horrible symptoms, and being there with them, because as you say, I can't distract myself by exercise because I can't. That there was, obviously that's incredibly uncomfortable. It's physically uncomfortable. It's mentally uncomfortable. But I think what I found very, very difficult was that actually there were bits of myself I didn't like that much. And there were bits where I felt, I think a lot of my constant doing had been to kind of, cover up this, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough, so I need to do more. I need to do more. I keep to keep pushing, and this sort of drive to always be the best. And even when you succeed of something, it's still not good enough kind of thing. So it's that, constant unworthiness. And then, of course, when you have something like long COVID, you maybe aren't working, you're not able to do the things that you want to do or that you are, quote unquote, supposed to be doing, caring for children, working, doing chores around the house, whatever it is, which kind of piles on to that kind of feeling of unworthiness that maybe I had before. And then you just end up feeling completely useless because, I've failed as a human. I can't do anything. And that is a horrible place to be because you feel really, really uncomfortable with all of that. So as you say, it can be a very difficult place to be, and you sort of have to face up to and sort of confront maybe things that you don't like and that you don't want.
And that's a really insightful awareness, I think, that we can discover about ourselves, and very uncomfortable as well to have that discovery. And it can come from a place for many people of, having experienced perhaps not knowing how to soothe or be soothed, from really early years, that maybe that wasn't available. And so we build these kind of coping mechanisms around us, these adaptive techniques that, how clever are we as humans that this is how we learn to survive. But I use that word survive because it isn't thriving, because it's not necessarily good for us. In the moment, it was necessary. And then as we get older, those patterns might continue. We learn that actually this is really unhealthy and keeping me from addressing perhaps, or the awareness of what's underneath, which is that I felt not good enough, or I felt unworthy of receiving the care and the love and the soothing comfort that we might have needed at that time. And I recognize we're kind of going quite deep here, and these are kind of like very therapy-based issues that, most people we need support with while we're dealing with this awareness. And I think it's also really important to say that there's also, for many people, the societal awareness of what it means to be a human. You said I felt like I was failing as a human because I'm not doing the things that I feel I have to do as a human. And then suddenly, well, who does that make us? That we can't do those things. And the whole world is saying, you need to be working constantly, and you need to be able to look after everybody, and you need to look a certain way, and you need to be able to achieve a certain thing, all the while, of course, looking after ourselves, because, the self-care kind of bombardment of what it means to look after ourselves requires an awful lot of energy as well. So we're dealing not only with the internal kind of environment that we find ourselves in and what we're dealing with internally, but also the external pressure of living in a society that really doesn't necessarily support recovery from illness, and does require us, or certainly encourages us, to really push on through. And I speak about this in the book, in terms of, we were talking a bit about exercise and using exercise for mental health, and that need to almost reframe what it means to exercise. And maybe we can't exercise in the same way because we're dealing with a really horrible illness. And yet it's still important that we can find movement in different ways. And actually that can become really soothing. That can become a really lovely way to show ourselves some compassion, that we acknowledge, yeah, we used exercise for this, but now I'm going to do something different, which is actually kind to myself in a different way. Because exercise is so often used as almost like a punishment in some ways. And look, I love exercise, so I'm not anti-exercise, but for a long while, I couldn't exercise in the way that I used to. And I really recognize how it was a real kind of crutch for distraction in many ways as well as being, obviously very good for us. And I get that. But what about when we can't do it? And what I find most often with people is how disconcerting it can be to invite someone to only move in ways that feel good for them. Because exercise so often forces us to move our bodies kind of through, just do it, through the pain threshold, keep going, feel the burn, all these. I feel like Jane Fonda now. I'm going to get up and do some star jumps. But yeah, that kind of attitude that means you've got to just keep doing it. You've got to reach that target or achieve that thing and personal best this and whatever. But actually, if we reframe exercise, and maybe even if we call it something slightly different, like movement, it can become something that's actually very nurturing and very caring of ourselves when we allow ourselves to move in ways that do genuinely feel good for our bodies. And that can be a really helpful process, I think, to go through on a recovery journey, is learning that about ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. I had never done yoga before in my life. In fact, I actually would have turned my nose up at yoga and said, that sounds like hippie crap to me. I am not interested. I'm going to go pound out a 10K and the hippies and their crystals can all, congregate together. No, thank you. That's me from 5 years ago. And, you know, I discovered yoga and I found it really helpful because, as somebody who had to exercise, I had this need to move to exercise, and yet I couldn't, or when I tried to, it just made everything so much worse. And it was something that allowed me to gently move. And there was something that the guy that I was doing it with, he said, don't listen to me, listen to your own body, which was such an insightful thing to say because I'm exactly the sort of person that would be like, oh, well, if he can do that many whatever it is movements, then so can I. In fact, maybe I can do even more because, I'm me. And it was, as you say, moving in gently in a way that feels good to me rather than what I quote unquote should be doing. And, it really kind of opened up my world to kind of gentle movement, but also, as we've been kind of saying, that being with yourself. But it was something about being with myself whilst doing some very gentle movement that made it a lot more acceptable to me rather than just, lying and being with myself whilst not doing anything else. And I don't know, I mean, maybe that still counts as a distraction. I don't know, but it seemed to work for me.
I don't know if it counts as a distraction. Only probably if you're doing it like 24/7, that becomes the only way that you can be with yourself. So I think if you're doing it in a healthy way, it's all good. And I think you've really hit upon some really interesting things because I think what we can learn about ourselves kind of on the mat, as it were, can be really interesting, and we can take those things that we learn into our lives. But I think I agree with you. So many people come and they're like, I've been told to try yoga. I don't want to try yoga. I'm not flexible. I don't really want to get involved in that hippie shit. And I'm like, I hear you. But actually, this isn't necessarily yoga that we might think it is, because actually a lot of the times that we see yoga, we're looking at a very dynamic practice. Maybe, we see lots of images on social media and they tend to be a certain type of image, and you've got to have all the gear and you've got to, be able to do these very complex pretzel-y movements with your body and do everything super fast and be very super strong. And of course, that is an aspect to some people's yoga practice, but it's absolutely not where we need to begin when we're recovering. Absolutely not. It needs to be more of a therapeutic, I think, kind of movement-based practice that is really focused on being mindful towards our body, being with ourselves. And I love that your teacher said that, because I so often say to people, there's always somebody that says, am I doing this right? And I say, well, there's only one right way, and it's the right way for you, and you are the person that knows your body best. I do not know what that feels like in your body. So, and I do say to people, if somebody tells you you're doing it wrong, maybe they're the wrong teacher for you, which, may be a bit controversial to say, but I genuinely believe that, because there can be no right way to do yoga, in my opinion. And again, maybe that is controversial. But certainly yoga therapy, this is the way we work. We work in a very invitational way. It's about what feels good for the person. It's about being with ourselves as we go through the journey of maybe doing things a little bit differently and getting curious. What's our response when we slow down a bit? Because it's in those slower moments that we really get to notice what's going on in our bodies. We really give ourselves time to be with ourselves. And that's actually can be a very, again, challenging place, but actually a really beautiful place as well. And certainly a place that our nervous system needs to be to get to that space where we can start to heal and recover, because, the rest and digest system, the parasympathetic nervous system, it needs to be treated gently. It doesn't need to be forced into something that will ultimately keep it stuck in that, often home from home type space. But again, that's acknowledging that it is not an easy journey if we've been used to being constantly on the go. And it can feel very, very uncomfortable at first, but it's definitely what our bodies need in recovery, for sure, and through that recovery journey.
Yeah, and this brings us back to, something you said right at the start. It all starts with that self-compassion, I guess, doesn't it? Kind of full circle in a beautifully, accidentally crafted way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really beautiful place to leave it, I think, for today. The book is live this week. We'll put the link into the show notes. And we're going to come back and talk a bit more about this, because I think we've both just realized that there's an awful lot more to be said on this topic. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been my absolute pleasure, and we'll do this again.
Absolutely. It's always lovely to see you, Jackie, and speak with you. And just thank you so much for supporting this condition and the recovery of it.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.